Thank you, Geoff. I'm sure you'll all agree it's a fascinating account of culture over time and how it might play out and how it has played out in the past and how it might play out in the future. As he was speaking, I sort of pictured in my mind our hyper-efficient civil service in Singapore going out and investing heavily in snowmaking machines to improve our happiness quotient.
It's what Dubai is doing, of course.
But I was fascinated by the story you were telling us about how culture began as culture for the elites, high art and opera and things like that, sharing their cultural experiences. And then we moved into culture for the masses, the democratization of culture, social and community building and nation building and social values and transmission of all of that. And how in the future, culture might be for humanity, to remind us who we are and the soul that we have, and differentiate us from the robots and artificial intelligence. And also, I was struck by your point about creativity and how that will be a big predictor about the jobs of the future. And especially heartened that in your list of jobs that might survive into the future, you had tailors and photographers and design thinking and storytelling, all of which gives hope for people like me in journalism. I think my colleagues in the newsroom will be very happy to hear that. But I think since this is a conference about the future of culture and the culture of the future, it's a very future-oriented session, let's start by talking about the future. And maybe you could flesh out for the audience here some of the cutting-edge technologies that you are coming across. You mentioned some of them, the use of holograms and talking statues and things like that. Tell us a little bit of where you see the future in terms of AR and VR and how some of it is being used by people who are creating culture today and where that might be going.
Well, you have some fantastic speakers on this later today who are better qualified than me. I'll maybe just mention sort of 3 or 4 dimensions of this. The first, which I think is really exciting, is just what could happen to the fabric of cities. And we've had a few attempts at this, trying to imagine what the city square of the future would be, where every surface is not just, as at the moment you can do quite easily with projected pictures on it, but responds to people. As you walk across a square, can you be followed by lights? Can you see walls responding to you or perhaps playing with your gait? There's all sorts of possibilities there of essentially adding in sensors, little bits of AI, etc., to turn the experience of public spaces into something more like a performance, like a theatre. And I think we're going to see many cities experimenting with that. There's a bit happening already, but it's usually one-off festivals or installations, not part of the everyday fabric. And in a way, this takes us back to very ancient ideas about civic spaces as performative and cultural places of meaning generation. I think there's a very different strand of possibilities for galleries and buildings, where I think the frustration for many people at the moment is that particularly the VR tools are so isolating and individual. You go into a gallery, put on a VR headset and do slightly weird movements and look a bit crazy. And the search for some more collective versions of that, where we can, with a group, experience, again, a responsive physical environment. I think that will be very exciting. I think we're not quite there yet, though we're happy to be told otherwise. We are then going to see, again, already this is happening, the extraordinary amplification of tools for everyday creativity by the public. I mean, the fact that even on iMovie, anyone can make really quite high quality films in their own home, or can use things like Logic Pro to, again, make really high quality music. There's a fantastic product just on the market a couple of months ago from a UK company, which is the whole of, essentially it's an orchestra, which you can then control through your own keyboard, but with very precise dynamics of every instrument. And it's so sophisticated, and you just wonder what on earth would Beethoven have done with something like that. But it means that anyone, you can't become Beethoven, but you can become a bit closer. So, and those are moving very, very fast. And then, of course, we will see the tailoring and customization of offerings in a way, that's the slightly worrying side of digital and culture, as in so much of digital at the moment, is the risk of separating people into even more precisely targeted bubbles, where they think because you like this film, this theatre, this music, therefore you will only like things just like it, which is the logic of Amazon recommendations and YouTube. I think we will want some institutions to do the opposite, to help people experience the completely unexpected and unpredictable things they would never have dreamed they would have liked. And I think that's perhaps one of the key roles for public arts bodies, is to constantly surprise the public.
That's fascinating. Let me take up that example that you mentioned on the orchestra, because I'm an orchestra lover as well, and I see my friend Huck Ping in the audience as well. About a week ago, I got a letter in the snail mail, as old-fashioned as it gets, and it was from the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra, offering me a Christmas present. And these days, I'll take presents from anyone. And it was to try to encourage me to resubscribe to a digital subscription to their digital concert hall. So if you think about it, obviously they were using data to track my usage and the fact that I was a lapsed subscriber. And to offer me a digital subscription to their concerts, as well as their new recording of the Beethoven's Ninth Symphony to celebrate the 250th anniversary. So here was an orchestra, a cultural institution, using data, using new technology, and also using a historical event. So you've got that whole interplay of past, present, and future there. Looking at how you are seeing it, do you see the future of orchestras being, allowing audiences to experience being in the making of that music as well through AR and VR?
Yeah. So three examples. About 12 years ago, we started a thing called NT Live, which was a National Theatre Live, which was essentially streaming National Theatre performances into cinemas around the UK. And then the Met obviously does that now from New York. But that was when that was started, people were very sceptical whether anyone would actually want to go to a cinema to watch a theatre performance. And there was the fear that it would cannibalise audiences. And in fact, people did want to go because they wanted some collective experience, even if it wasn't the one in the capital city, and it appeared to have no negative effect on audiences for face-to-face traditional theatre. The second example is one of the ones we funded through our R&D fund, which was for the Royal Opera House. And that essentially, very much as you described, helped them create a digital sort of surround for the opera performance, where you could much more easily find out the history of the writing, previous performances, see stage sets, and again, it would allow the audience to have a much richer experience, which then hopefully they would not again discourage them from actually buying the ticket to see the opera itself, but would enhance it and educate the audience. And that's been very popular, and there are lots of versions of that. And then finally, we've now got a number of the Audience of the Future projects are allowing you to be within an orchestra as it plays, using VR, so you can choose, this is true for theatre as well, where increasingly you can choose to be on stage and be part of the action, and if you want to experience being the piccolo player or so on, you will be able to do so with VR. I'm still not totally convinced that will be such an enhancement over the normal audience experience, but at least we're experimenting with that.
Okay. Yeah. I think we should make this an interesting experience for our audience as well and take some questions. Get ready your questions. I'll come to you in a minute, but before I do that, I do want to take up some of the points in the thought-provoking opening remarks by Gu Swee Chen about how the big issues you put on the table, basically the aging of our society, and you mentioned it as well, that liberation of time, where we all move to Netherlands and have a lot more time to make art and culture. Tell us a little bit about that. And the second part is climate change. I see many questions coming in about what will the impact of climate change be, what opportunities that will create for culture and arts in the future. So aging and climate change.
Well, the ageing question goes back to actually your first remark. So you say that arts policy began as sort of elitist. In the UK, interestingly, there was a prior period in the 30s and 40s where it was expected that the main role of arts policy would be supporting amateur arts. The local orchestra, choir, amateur theatre group. And there was a really strong push for that being the main purpose of public policy, was to let millions of people take part as creators and shapers. Then, after the Second World War, it essentially got captured by the elite, and the majority of money went to opera, which had a tiny audience, but a very influential audience. The top civil servants and bankers and so on loved the opera and managed to take most of the public money for their own pleasure in a slightly dubious way. And I think in many countries ever since there's been a bit of a tension between those, whereas that first amateur-oriented approach obviously is much more relevant to an aging population where many people have a lot of time but also are highly skilled as in playing music or writing poetry or acting. So I think we will see a new version of that intensive argument from the 1940s. I think another argument, which is very live in many European cities at the moment, is between the centre and the periphery. So again, in the last 30 or 40 years, all the money was taken by the central institutions in the city centre, often aimed at tourists. And now, certainly in Rome, Berlin, other big cities, the pressure is much more on to provide experiences and activities in the suburbs, the periphery, often lower income areas, and that to include participation opportunities, not just consumption. And again, you'd expect with an ageing population, those pressures might continue. But I'd be fascinated to hear from all of you here what the thinking is. On climate change, there are so many dimensions to this at the moment. We have a very prominent organisation called Extinction Rebellion in the UK at the moment, which have really rethought the demonstration as a cultural performance. So they take over the bridges of London and do essentially almost theatre performances, dance, etc., as part of trying to engage people to think in different ways about climate change. I would say a large proportion of the artists, filmmakers and so on are absolutely passionate about this issue and want to use their tools to make the public aware of what it will look like, a world with 3, 4, 5 degrees warming. And one of the things we spent early this week on was COP26. So the UK is hosting the next big climate gathering in Glasgow next September, these massive gatherings. And the question there is what can be created as a cultural sort of surround for that gathering, which will be really high impact. And probably it will be installations helping people picture rising sea levels, 4 or 5 degree warming, what that will mean for everyday life, to scare people, to be honest. Rather than them just having nice meals and drinking together.
Okay, let's take the most highly rated question, since we are a highly democratic country. Right. 26 votes for this question on, how do I get this up on the screen? There we are. How can the arts and cultural industry compete with the creative economy industries like gaming, animation, immersive experiences, Disney and Netflix? Can the arts compete with entertainment? Netflix, sleep versus the arts.
Well, I suspect in most countries the correct response is a combination of collaboration and competition. So in many ways, the experiences of going to the Berlin Philharmonic or going to a real classic arts museum or gallery, let alone taking part in being a member of a choir, these are completely unlike watching a Netflix movie at home. And one of the weaknesses of all of these industries listed here is they are very individual in their consumption model. Gaming slightly less, and there are obviously vast gaming gatherings, but the predominant model is you are essentially on your own and maybe linked online with some other people. I think there's a craving for human interaction. And one of the great surprises to the futurists of 20 or 30 years ago was just how strongly we want to be in rooms with other human beings. So if you read futurology of the 1960s or 70s, it predicted certainly the end of live music, live sports. The university would have completely gone by now. There's a famous Peter Drucker predicted by 2010 there would be no university campuses because everything would be online. What's happened in industries is much more complicated. So in music, payment for recorded music has, I think, halved roughly in the last 15 years as it's gone on to iTunes and so on. But people going to live concerts, the numbers have risen. The same for live sports. You both watch more, maybe pay-per-view on satellite cable, etc., and go and want to be in a crowd experiencing the roar of the event. So part of the reason there are festivals and carnivals all over the world is tapping into that desire for, in some ways, a very basic human wish to be in a crowd with others experiencing something in real time. There's a wonderful book by an American writer called William McNeill called Keeping Together in Time, which looks through history at the incredible importance of people doing things physically in time with others, both in armies and in bands and choirs and dance and so on. And we a few weeks ago held an event on how could we combine VR and AR and so on with this underlying human desire to be doing things in time with others, perhaps on the dance floor. Anyway, that's part of, I think, the answer to competition is that's the limitation of most of the digitized offerings listed there.
Is there someone in the audience who wants to get on the dance floor and ask a question as well, or do we just do this electronically? Anyone, just raise your hands if you've got a question you'd like to shoot to Geoff.
And just on dancing, so one of the other things we've funded for quite a few years in the UK, a thing called social prescribing, which is getting local doctors to prescribe social experiences instead of drugs, particularly to older people. And the evidence of a prescription for a dance class is nearly always better than a drug. And about a month ago, our Minister of Health announced an academy of social prescribing. It's become integrated into our health service, and dance does come top of the health-enhancing prescriptions.
I think this is a good question for you, Geoff, since you're in NESTA. What are your views on the intersection between the arts and the sciences? How do you advocate the arts to policymakers who are used to seeing the arts only as CCA, extracurricular activities, basically?
Right. Well, we're rather envious of you in that respect with your extraordinary arts and science museum. I mean, I guess coming from an organisation which has science and arts in the title, I sort of take it for granted that they are interwoven. There's a huge number of scientists who got their inspiration for a scientific breakthrough from the arts, and vice versa. We are in a period where the artists in residence in places like CERN, are seeing all sorts of extraordinary hybrids and combinations of astronomy and arts, or cellular biology and arts. That it just seems really strange to separate them. And in terms of education, we have, again, like many around the world, been trying to push STEAM instead of STEM, to say that although you do want children to learn science, technology, engineering and maths, that's great. If you don't also add an arts and creativity element, you're letting them down in terms of their future careers, let alone everything else. And one of the reasons we've done all of this analysis on future jobs demand is to get policymakers to see how these fields are so interconnected now, and that science without arts is a bit dry and useless. But I thought Singapore knows all of this.
Let me take this question, which I think is quite fascinating because it might give us put things in context of what's going on around the world today. I mean, we see culture as a unifying force from what you're describing, and culture to take us into the future. But culture can also be highly divisive. And in an age of growing populism, how do we prevent cultures from making us more narrow in our focus rather than accepting of diversity and differences?
So I think in Europe, this is probably the biggest question of the next few years, and it's a very big question, so I'm going to drink some water before answering it.
You probably need vodka rather than
or a vodka. So climate change actually is a very live side of this. So in almost every European country, and I think the US and Canada certainly it's the same, you can see a rapidly sharpening polarization of attitudes around climate change which are becoming more cultural. In the cities, young, highly educated people see climate change as the most important issue of our times, the only real test of what we all do with our power and our money. They will march with Extinction Rebellion, they will become vegans, they will change their lifestyles, they will campaign, and this matters a lot. And almost in reaction to that, you see in the smaller towns, the rural areas, old manufacturing areas, particularly older men reacting very strongly against that, beginning to define themselves almost as anti-climate change believers. There was a new party in Canada this autumn in the election, largely founded around that. The populist parties in countries like Finland and Sweden, France and so on are increasingly almost taking pride in being anti-climate change action. So what was a kind of scientific or public policy issue is becoming cultural. So the question, how do we rebuild communication, empathy, conversation, mutual understanding between those two groups is absolutely critical for action on climate change. At the same time, one of the things we've written about recently is a broader version of the same divide which affects the creative and knowledge economy. And just give me a minute or so to explain this. I think 20 or 30 years ago, there was a hope that as the economy became more knowledge intensive, data intensive, etc., there would kind of be a trickle down. Everyone would end up benefiting. But instead, in most of the world, certainly the developed world, that hasn't happened. There's been almost a confinement of the leading edge of the knowledge and creative economy to particular places, to cities like this, or London, or San Francisco, or Paris, while other places have been completely left behind, even their own suburbs, let alone towns and rural areas. You can see the divide between the leading edge companies and the average. The gap between the frontier companies, the Googles, Alibabas and so on, and the average company has widened in terms of productivity. You see the social divide between those with a degree or 3 or 4 degrees and, again, the average or the rest. And this stretching of the social fabric is having all sorts of consequences. It's one of the explanations, we think, for stagnant productivity in the economy across much of the world. It's driving social inequality and divisions, and it's increasingly shaping politics, where voting behavior in many countries now correlates more with your education level than with anything else. And in a way, that's a proxy for whether you think you can take part in the dynamic knowledge economy. So the big dilemma for an organization like mine, and perhaps for yours, is there's quite an easy strategy for the next 10 years where we do amazingly cool, exciting things in London, Manchester, Edinburgh, using all these technologies, but which essentially pander to the winners of the knowledge economy. The people who are already part of it, benefiting, very globalized, very optimistic, and so on. And we completely ignore those millions of people who are feeling left behind and increasingly angry and increasingly culturally hostile to this globalized, emergent, high-tech culture. And for them, many of them are returning to older identities of nation or ethnicity or religion as part of that reaction against the imbalances of the knowledge economy. So that's a long answer to a short question, but I do see further increasing polarization. I think many of the creative economy workers are part of that metropolitan, rather privileged bubble. And I think a crucial role we're trying to do is just to get more social interaction between them and the left behind. because they often live in, social media bubbles where they just literally don't communicate with anyone who is experiencing the world in such a different way. In 2 years' time, our government, if it's re-elected in a week's time, goodness me, is planning a post-Brexit festival, which fills us all with horror. And yet, we have such bitterness over Brexit at the moment in Britain that part of me really hopes we turn that into a challenge to the creative world. What can be done at a national level, a town level, or even a street level, perhaps with meals and mini festivals to rebuild bridges over this very polarized, unhappy, sort of angry public? If anyone's got great ideas, please let me know.
This being Singapore, I've just got a message from the organizer saying we can go overtime and make you work a bit harder.
Oh, no.
So I can take one or two more questions from anybody in the audience if you have a question you really want to ask.
Or a good idea for the post-Brexit festival, please.
Let me see your show of hands, otherwise I'll stick with Pigeonhole. Yes, someone at the back, please.
Hi, my name is Zue. I'm from the Arts Council. I noted in your bio that you wrote a book about collective intelligence recently. Can you tell us more about collective intelligence and how that's relevant in this world of technology and what we've been talking about, and how that kind of intersects with the point that our guest of honor mentioned in her opening remarks about how art is used as a force against universalism. So how do these two ideas kind of contest with each other?
So I won't give you a lengthy lecture on collective intelligence, so I encourage you to read the book, which is out in paperback next week. And essentially what that is about is how, alongside all the progress we're making in data and artificial intelligence, that's intelligence embodied in machines like your smartphone or computers or traffic systems, we've become increasingly interested in the parallel, which is how do you organize human intelligence at large scale. So examples you will all be familiar with are ones like Wikipedia, which is a collective intelligence encyclopedia. In science, things like Galaxy Zoo, you may know, where 1 million people, essentially amateur astronomers watching out for new stars. There's lots of these things in nature, in healthcare, millions of patients sharing data, funding research to help solve rare diseases. And I've become increasingly convinced there is an emerging science and practice of collective intelligence, that it will be critical to the future of actually how governments work, how health systems work, and how the world solves the Sustainable Development Goals. And if you're really interested, our biggest program at the moment is with the United Nations, applying collective intelligence methods to the SDGs across Africa, Asia, and so on. That's a topic for another day. There is, though, a really interesting arts strand on that. And indeed, our last big event on this in October, we had a whole series of presentations of new ways of mobilizing large groups using collective intelligence methods as part of a cultural experience. So it could be, a town running a festival where it's trying to tell a new story of itself through a mixture of getting lots of people to create mini videos or stories and so on, but also projecting things on whole walls across the town, so the community sees itself as a single brain, in a sense, analyzing, creating, organizing memory. And there are some amazing organizations now applying collective intelligence methods in the arts and in culture. I think this will become a really important field. It's not quite there yet, though Singapore would be very well placed to be in the forefront. Actually, one of the projects presented at our conference took place here, I think about a year ago, under Umbrellium, an arts organization. Watch this space. Whether that is an answer to the point about universalism, I don't know. Collective intelligence, in a way, is fractal. It can be my street, organising itself more like a collective intelligence to handle its own physical design, play spaces, crime, etc. It could be a town, it can be a city, a country, or the whole world. So I think it's entirely viable to have collective intelligence methods to allow groups to explore difference rather than to try and converge them all into standardization. But I very strongly agree with the spirit of the comment, which is we want the arts to be a source of disruption, dissent, heresy, and not of too much conformism. I would be very sad if collective intelligence became a force of crushing, stifling conformism, but I don't think that's a danger quite yet.
As a follow-up to that, I would say Geoff has a new book, Social Innovation, which will be launched this afternoon, am I right?
Yeah.
Could you just tell us briefly what the book is about?
So that's a book about really the emerging field of using innovation methods to solve social problems. And it's quite a lively field around the world. President Obama had a social innovation office in his White House. The European Union is running big programs on social innovation around everything from elder care to reducing plastics use. And the book tries to bring together a lot of experiences and examples. And perhaps I could give one live example, which I mentioned to you just before the session, but which perhaps brings a few of these threads together. So in the last 20 years or so in the UK, as in many countries, we've seen almost a collapse of local media, local newspapers, local radio, mainly because their main source of revenue, which was advertising, has been taken by Google and Facebook and others. Our government commissioned a big review last year of all the things going wrong in a way in the news, from fake news to this collapse of local news. And they recommended the creation of an R&D fund, essentially, to develop new models for running local news. And they recommended we should run it. We are now running it. It's called the Future News Fund. And what it's trying to do, very like our R&D fund in the arts, is to find new ideas which are a combination of a technology model, some way of organizing a platform, a business model, some way of funding that, which can be everything from micropayments to advertising to whatever, and likely some combination of professional paid journalists like Warren, but also probably collective intelligence, so mobilizing volunteers in the public, not only to generate news items, but also to scrutinize them, test their veracity, and so on. Anyway, our deadline is the end of this week, which is tomorrow, of course, for our first round of applicants. And we're hoping this will be part of essentially applying sort of social innovation methods to this really deep problem, not just in our media, but actually in our society. Because if you don't have reliable public interest news at a local level, it's very hard for anything else to function, whether a court system or democracy.
I couldn't agree with him more, and there's an idea for the MCCY to take up. Just for that, I'm going to spare you the question on Brexit and the future of the arts in the UK. Let me conclude with this question, which I think is probably a good way for us to round up. What are the best levers to inspire the next generation of audiences?
Oh, I don't know. Goodness me. You will know the answers to that. And in a way, I suspect the answers will be so multiple and varied. I think of young teenagers. I have a 12-year-old son, for example, who, like many 12-year-olds, was obsessed with Fortnite. Then has completely lost interest in Fortnite. And what will motivate him and his friends will be very compelling experiences, which probably do have that social element, which are using some gamification elements to make things exciting. Whereas for my mother, none of that will have any effect at all, and she will probably want something which is, kind of an enrichment to perhaps a familiar experience, like the Opera House example I gave. So, in a way, probably this is a question not best answered by people like me, or probably by many people like you, or any of us who are bureaucrats, and I'm basically a bureaucrat by training. The reason why I like the open processes of arts funding and of challenges like the challenge I just described on the media, is their assumption is that the best ideas will be out there, not in here. So, and certainly the best ideas of what will really inspire people, you discover by trying things out, by experiment. And ideally trying things out very fast and quite small, and then when you see something really has an effect, really motivates people, gets their eyes glistening, then you pile in behind it. And I guess so many of the innovation methods of now are about doing that, not about trying to have a plan, not about trying to predict that in 2025 this will be the dominant technology, this is what audiences will love, because none of us can know, but turning everything into a dynamic discovery process. Perhaps that's the note on which to end, and that's the ideal sort of mental framework for arts and cultural policy, is very energetic, very curious, very open willingness to explore and discover.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you will agree with me that was a fascinating session and a great way to start our discussion on the future of culture. Please join me in thanking our...
Thank you.